Do we need a change in the policy on education? Do we need a change in our education policy? So that will be our topic. To give an introduction, we will trace a brief history of the education policy in India. To start with, we have the Radhakrishnan Commission in 1950s, which led to the formation of University Grants Commission. And then we had the historic Kothari Commission, and then we had the Sampitroda Commission in 2004, and later we had Kasturi Rangan Commission, which led to the formulation of National Education Policy in 2020. From 1950 to 2020, we had 3 national education policies for India. One was in 1968, which was a response to the Kothari Commission. Then we had that in 1986 during the tenure of Rajiv Gandhi. And this will be the 3rd national education policy of independent India. In that context, we will be speaking about whether we need a change in the education policy for this nation. What are the things that we can change with regard to the education in this country? And we have 2 academics, a person who runs a school and a person from a university, Alliance University, a notable academic from Bangalore. So we have 2 eminent speakers, and we will listen to their vision of how to change our education system. To begin with, I would like to ask both of you, what are your the vision regarding education for future India, for the with regard to the future of this world and this country? How will we change education? What are the things that you want to see as a change in the current education system? I think we will begin from Anirudh, sir. Yeah, sure.
Am I audible now? Oh, good. Well, thanks for the question. It really depends on what you mean by future. Generally, the term is associated with a kind of fast technologizing, sort of AI-riddled world in which the future is sort of determined by technocrats and a few sort of button-pushing, accessories we call human beings. But essentially, the future will, is not an it's inevitable process, right? So the changes you make to the education system will have a certain effect or impact on the way in which the future is. So rather than thinking of it as something that's dependent on on a kind of decided future, that we should be training our students to, meet certain technological needs that we've already decided is how the future is going to be, we've got to start thinking about education as something that will in turn shape the future. So, I have specific thoughts on what those changes ought to be, but, we can get into those specifics as and when we go.
So my thought is slightly different from Dr. Anirudh's. So what I believe is, I agree with the first part of what you said. We're living in a time where technology is driving the change. And up until 2050, there's a lot of technological predictions that have already come in terms of what AI and neuroscience and all those kind of technologies, how they're going to drive change around the world. So that gives us some amount of scope as to how we need to prepare our students. What I mean by students is, since I run a school, I would speak from the perspective of a school student. So we're talking about kids who will probably be out in the job market, be an entrepreneur or excelling in whatever profession they want in the next 15 to 20 years, which means that I wouldn't say it's not so predictable world, which is 20 years ahead. It's a fairly predictable world with the amount of technology developments and the evangelists who are driving this change. So we kind of know what's happening. So from that perspective, there is a lot of scientific studies that are happening today that kind of helps us to decide on what and how we need to train our students on. So primarily, I believe this is where I would have a slight disagreement, which is in the sense, in terms of skill sets, I think we need to critically focus on developing 5 to 6 skills, which is going to help our children today be successful whichever way the world is going to go in. And those are things like creativity, problem-solving skills, lateral thinking skills, the communication skills, ability to learn new things. So let's suppose we decide the world is going to go X. Now let's say it's going to take another tangent and go Y. if you are a person who have the ability to learn, and if you have the skill of being adaptable to another environment, that would help you become successful in the future. So what I believe is how we need to prepare for the future is at the level of primary education, secondary education, and the initial higher education stages, focus on developing skills like creativity and those ones I spoke about. So that is what I believe we need to focus on in these times.
So, since we were hearing from him and he was speaking about the ways in which science and technology will advance in the near future, but at the same time, when we speak about education policy, we usually focus on the development of science and technology in general. But still, we have another strands of knowledge like humanities. We have liberal arts, art forms, fine arts, etc. So, as a researcher from humanities, as an academic of humanities background, how do you see the future of humanities? How do you see the future of humanities in India and in the world in general?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, broadly speaking, my view is that an education policy ought to be designed based on what is good for the development of the individual, situated in a community, right? So, the idea that somehow we've got to fit individuals to a certain technological machine, that is to say, including the sort of armature of government and everything that comes within it, is a utilitarian way of looking at education. And in many ways, the liberal arts, especially as how we conceived of it when we sort of were thinking about how to design a liberal arts school at Alliance, is to not think about education in those purely utilitarian terms, but rather to think about the development of the individual. And I completely agree that there are certain important tenets that cut across disciplines like problem solving, creativity, and so forth, that are essential parts of an education system. But one thing I might, perhaps like to add, so given the sort of, broad predictions about the obsolescence of lawyers and doctors and whatnot by AI, right, by the study in The Economist and the Oxford Martin School and so forth. Remember that many of these studies were themselves done by AI, so it's very difficult to trust them. But nevertheless, there are all kinds of other scenarios that we can say will happen based on predictions. Let's say climate change, is one such. By all accounts, the temperature is going to cross the dreaded 2 degrees Celsius no matter what we do. So let's say then that we live in a world of, utter, physical disaster. What do we, how do we prepare our children for that? Is necessarily the ability to, be very quick at solving calculus problems going to help there? Perhaps it will with, the kinds of technologies that emerge in order to fight that. But broadly speaking, I do think that there's one thing missing on the list that you gave, which is that education should involve the body in fundamental ways, because there's a certain sort of almost science fiction-like fantasy that we're going to be soon enough sort of detached minds in sort of glass jars, but other predictions like the sort of the erosion of soil and the depletion of the health of our food growing systems, etc. Those kinds of indicators tell me that individuals should be more profoundly aware of their material circumstances and their embodied selves. And starting off at a very young age, kindergarten, primary school is a very good place to sort of incorporate that into the policy. Yeah.
Similarly, sir, since you spoke about skill development has become a buzzword in Indian education sector and policy structuring, of course, it is. But at the same time, when we think about skills and skill development, for whom does the skill serve? Usually, in a context of policy making, there is always all the skills that have been, even the policies, the government interventions in skill development actually serve the purpose of a kind of a capitalist or a neoliberal economic project that is being here. So beyond that, where do we locate that critical acumen that you were thinking, you are speaking about? So like, if I can say that what Paulo Freire was what Paulo Freire was conceptualizing as a critical pedagogy, where do we think that the students think politically, students think socially, students become socially sensitive? How do we build such skills? So whenever we speak about skills, we speak only about the skills that will suit for job seeking purposes. But beyond job seeking, there is a purpose of life. we have to live this life. So where are those skills that help the students to live the life?
No, great question actually. So that's so initially when I spoke about a lot of skills, those are skills that make us go live in this consumeristic world. Now, but there are obviously life, and you need to live the life happily and successfully, and that requires a lot of skills. Now, one thing is what you said is very important, being the critical learning part, which is something that's missing in today's education, because our education system doesn't encourage or appreciate criticality. Nobody wants to be asked questions. There are very few teachers who love to be asked questions, because that means they have to do an extra job, probably an extra night of work, and they need to be having a broader, deeper understanding of their topic. So I'll tell you a typical example why we have to really look into this element, because all our questions in the schooling system, at least colleges, slowly things are changing. We are only talking about application oriented. We are talking about multiple answer questions, but it's all black or white. There's no element of perspective. So like before how we spoke during the discussion, imagine we all learn history, right? Now, history has been made, redesigned as per the convenience of the political parties who have been in power from time to time. Now, so when the history that I studied is probably not exactly what my child is going to study, because it's probably, it's been redesigned by somebody who is at power. Now, this is what, this is being pushed down through the NCERT textbooks, which are again by people who are at the power. Now, what happens is, there is no critical element of learning there, because the child only learns from what is there in the textbook. If he doesn't write what he has learned, he's not going to get the marks. So what happens is, I believe there needs to be a lot of open learning, in the sense there needs to be, needn't have to be textbook. You don't have to put the child in a box. Let's say we want to talk about Indian history, a certain era. We want children, we call it the flip schooling in our school. We want the children to go back, use all possible research papers available, read from Google, watch videos, and come back with their perspectives and outlooks and their findings and present it in the class. There's a discussion, there's a debate, and children exchange perspectives. So this actually encourages critical learning. Now, the only demerit of this learning is, this child goes to the examination where the question is set by an external agency who doesn't appreciate this critical thinking, right? For them, there is only yes or no. So what happens is, though at school level or at college level, there needs to be a lot of critical learning elements that needs to come in, the system is not conducively designed. So there needs to be a lot of systematic change. But the fact that India being a large country with a lot of cultures and languages and perspectives, it's quite difficult for such a policy to be implemented at the centralized level. Yeah, that's my perspective.
I think you ended the note. You ended the particular articulation by speaking about languages. I think that becomes very important, since the National Education Policy of 2020 unambiguously states that we have to teach the children until class 5 in their mother tongue. But in a multicultural setting like India, where there is mutually incomprehensible languages, how are we going to pursue that project? What is the importance of language in education? What is the importance of mother tongue in education? And how are we going to implement that in a multicultural social setting like India? I think both of you can respond to that.
Well, I think, as with most sort of controversial policies, there are, goods and bads related to it. And I think there's things to be looked at in terms of different languages and the way in which we treat whatever language we end up choosing to begin with, right? So let's look at the first one first. Broadly speaking, there is a necessity to have a kind of lingua franca, right? A language in which people can do business with each other and communicate across cultures. That's nobody, as far as I can tell, is seriously questioning that. this idea was recognized, in the Middle Ages, let's say, where a kind of top-down, Sanskritization of the different Prakrits happened. Why? Because there was great mobility of traveling scholars between different empires, which necessitated a kind of common language of writing and debating and so forth. We happen to be saddled with English. Okay, so be it. For that purpose. Now, as far as I can tell, a culture is depleted to the extent that it doesn't have a common tongue, right? So, can English become a common tongue in India? The evidence is to the contrary. But on the other hand, if the education policy is, and I don't think it is that, but if it is, that in a given relatively culturally homogeneous context, if the idea is that there would be robust study of literature and literary criticism in a particular language so that individuals develop real facility with that language and are able to really find nuanced ways of speaking with one another, it's only to the credit of the complexity of their minds, right, that such a thing should happen. And you can just keep English as something in which business is done, right? So that's something that seems reasonable to me, as far as I can tell. Now, coming back to how we actually treat that one language that we end up picking, what I've noticed, and it kind of ties in with your previous question as well, of the importance of the humanities. As far as I can tell, even those in the humanities now are, to a great degree, sort of removing personality from language, and there's a kind of common, textbook language that's being encouraged in the humanities, right? Because the humanities are pretending to be a kind of scientific discipline, as it were, that can just produce objective knowledge. The scientists write in these symbols that everyone can read. We have to produce textbooks where the language will be commonly, standardized in that particular way. And these are the forces of capitalism are at play here. Adorno was writing about this in the 50s already. I don't know what he would say looking at the language that we write in the humanities. So linguistic complexity is important. If you can't get it with the common English tongue that's used for professional schools, then if you want to get it by rehabilitating native and local languages, then I think that may not be a terrible idea.
I totally agree with you, but one of the biggest challenges that we face, so I'm also a corporate trainer, as well as I also work with a lot of universities for their different type of training. So one challenge I've always faced with mostly our students is their inability to communicate in English confidently and with clarity. Now, I believe that the problem lies not because they are not speaking in English, it is because a lot of importance was given to the mother tongue. I'm for mother tongue, but there are scientific studies which says that a child need to first become confident and fluent in the mother tongue by the age of 4 or 5, so that he can pick up any language in the world. These are scientific studies. But what happens in the current education policy of 2020, the government has said strictly that the education at the early stages need to happen in the mother tongue. Now, the challenge here is, if a child is not exposed to the English language only as a subject but not as a communicative language, the ability for the child to pick this language up confidently and be able to speak will definitely go down. And that's going to affect, because India is, I'm again coming to the consumeristic part of it, because we are 1/6 of the world today in India. I mean, Indians are 1/6 of the world, which means we are the world workforce. And already our kids are going to Canada and the US and the Australia. So what's happening is language is a very critical element. Now, without English, it's going to be really difficult as we move forward. So my perspective is we should have English go along with the mother tongue. Have that very importantly, built into the system right from an early learning stage. That eventually will help them be confident in not just the mother tongue, but also in the English language. So that's my perspective. And also the NEP says that in colleges, there needs to be mother tongue based teaching. That's in a way will promote a lot of the rural students to get back to colleges, take up degrees. But what's going to happen is the students who have done their learning, the schooling in English, and they go to a higher education institution in their region, and if that is done in the mother tongue, they would find it extremely difficult. So there has to be a fine balance between the both, but I would definitely prioritize English because it's a global language.
Two of the other important catchphrases that was used repeatedly in new education policy 2020 was interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. Since we know that the foreign universities have been giving importance to interdisciplinary researches and setting up multidisciplinary syllabi for last 20 to 30 years, but we are just starting to speak about multidisciplinarity in India from 2020 only. As a person who has done your research from Oxford University, I hope you have done your research from Oxford University. So how do you compare the research culture, the academic culture in India and the in foreign academic spaces?
From my encounter with the terms interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity and so forth, it seems to be much more of a buzzword here than anywhere else. So it certainly, there's a lot of experimentation that's going on in India at the moment with these things, and it might have something to do with the idea of decolonizing our education system and so forth, because to a large degree, you talk about the UK's education system and so forth. I would argue that in many ways the putting disciplines in silos, right? Science is here and the humanities here, is something that was an accident of British politics in the 17th century, and that's just become entrenched in the education systems of the world because of the kind of influence that these two universities had through colonization, Oxford and Cambridge, that is, through colonization and so forth. So, in some ways, I would say, the fact that the Puritan anti-monarchists were at Cambridge doing science, and that the monarchists and the Roundheads were at Oxford studying the humanities and thinking of science as a kind of derisive kind of thing where people are getting their hands dirty and doing experimentations and so forth. That gets flipped over after Newton in those in the gap of those 200 years. The kind of inordinate success that scientific theories have in the realm of technology makes these two things so completely apart. No, as far as I can tell, no other culture in the history of human civilization has made this distinction so stark. So, in many ways, if India were to go multidisciplinary, then it would just be setting things normal and not being global, but being more native, as it were. The closest example that comes to mind is at Alliance, where a student in the liberal arts has to take applied maths and statistics, but at the same time also literature and politics and argumentation and things like that. That, as you were saying, critical thinking cuts across the different disciplines, and then there's sort of leeway to sort of lean towards one or the other. As far as I can tell, most of the great problems that are impending in the 21st century, climate change comes to mind again, but the vaccination question, which is again depoliticized because of the kind of authority that our culture gives to science, but they're deeply political questions, right? So these questions will require a kind of holistic thought process that certainly people who are funneled into engineering will not, or whatever, any kind of specific professional discipline will not be able to tackle seriously.
So my perspective is, I don't want to say it's good or bad. I believe that the system should be built in such a way that it should be left to the student's choice. Now, when I studied, I never had the option of learning music with economics and accounting. But what if I want to pursue a major in economics and a minor in music? In Indian system, it's quite difficult, but yes, there's a lot of changes coming in now. So what I'm trying to say is there has to be, the system should allow this option where the child can decide, the student can decide whether he needs to have the multidisciplinary option. The flip side to it is there's something evolving called micro learning, which is basically at a very early age, which is something that I am a big ambassador of. I very strongly believe that children from a very young age need to be taught about themselves, a lot of self-awareness, knowing what their skills are, strengths are, what their interest areas are, what their passion is. And there needs to be a lot of exposure to different activities at the school level. Again, that's where the multidisciplinary element comes in. And by the age of, probably at a high school, most of us say that, a 12th grader student is not matured enough to decide things for himself. But if we are able to actually train him, educate himself on who he is and what he is capable of, he is definitely eligible and capable to decide what he wants to do. So from that perspective, that's where micro-learning comes into perspective. So by 12th grade, I decide that I want to only study finance, or I want to only do photography. Now what happens is today's world is changing so much that I don't want to go and do a 3-year MBA or 2-year MBA and waste my time studying HR and operations and logistics and all that blah, because I just want to study finance. Now I can study finance from any part of the world today, sitting in the comfort of my home, with a lot of these online platforms that have come in, which to a large extent COVID has accelerated. So what happens is the system should be conducive for a child to pursue multidisciplines, but eventually we are all going to be very micro-focused. So that means a child who wants to pursue photography will only pursue photography for 6 months. A child who wants to pursue, a student who wants to pursue a diploma 6-month finance program in logistics will do that probably from a university in the UK and then start a job in that particular domain. Now for him, he doesn't want to study math and math is not relevant to him, or he doesn't want to study history because history is not relevant to him, but maybe he wants to study economics. So that option needs to be there, and I think it's very, very important to have that in the system. But it will evolve.
So even when we speak about the advancement or acceleration of digital technologies, there exists the stark reality of digital divide in India. Even when we speak about the depoliticization of academia, the national education policy clearly states that it wants to ensure a level playing field for private and public players in education. So we see a gradual withdrawal of government from education. So where is this going to? When capital enters, capital is making significant inroads into Indian higher education. We have private universities, and the numbers of private universities will increase indefinitely. So where will we ensure the social security benefits for the students? Who want this enable the creation of a certain kind of elitism within academia, within higher education? The higher education will only be possible to, is there a condition where higher education is only accessible to a privileged elite class of India? So how will we ensure, another key term that is being used in national education policy, inclusivity? Where is inclusivity? Where will we ensure the justice to the underprivileged caste, underprivileged class, etc.? So how will we manage that?
Brilliant question. So let me start off saying that in India, making money from education is a crime. It's so you can run hospitals and make money. You can run anything other than education. But a school owner can't make money. A university owner can't make money. So my first perspective is government needs to completely move out of education. Government cannot manage education. Government is not cut out to manage education. But that brings the element of you asking it becomes very elitist. It becomes difficult for the underprivileged to access education. So I think government is currently funding institutions. Now that has to change. Government completely steps out from education. Administration is completely done by the universities, the colleges, and the individual schools, which should become profit-making institutions. Why can't you make profit if you're giving quality education? The rest of the world works that way. Why not in India? So government should move into funding students and not institution. So what I mean by it, government can come up with scholarships. Government can offer, other schemes which will incentivize the students, and that is funded directly to the students and not to the institution, which is what currently happens. Now, the institutions, because of which the government institutions, except for if you leave the IITs, most of them are in a very bad plight. So, in coming to the government schools, leaving aside Kerala, because Kerala is a very unique case, rest of the country, government schools are in a pathetic situation. Now, think about government not funding the schools, but incentivizing the teachers, where the teachers need to make sure each government school in itself becomes a profit center. You need to make profit by running the institution, where the government is funding the underprivileged students through loans or scholarships or other schemes. They need to ensure that the kids come to school. The better school in terms of ranking or pass percentage, or because again the participation of the students, the teachers who are regularly coming, the teachers who are doing research, the teachers who are doing more than what they're supposed to do. So you need to set up certain benchmarks and quality checklist, and then based on that you decide whether a school gets incentivized. So government is not going to say, hey, every year this school is going to get 10 lakhs. Government is going to, at the end of the financial year, is look at what each of these schools have achieved. Okay, school A has, on these 10 parameters, have scored 7, which means on a budget of 10 crores, you get 0.01. But a school that has scored 9 out of 10 gets a much bigger share than what has been given to the school A. And this is not a direct funding, this is going through the students. So that's my perspective. Sum it up, government needs to step out of education.
Since I have some trust issues with capitalism, I don't think whether this will work in the same way that you say. And one more thing, that the same thing that you were trying to say, beyond Kerala, I don't know whether how will this work or not. So I have 2 serious concerns with that. And now we'll move on to the same question. How do you see the gradual withdrawal of government from education?
Well, I think it was F.M. Comfort who once said that every profession is a conspiracy against the laity. So, to a large degree, it's a kind of paradox that we're looking at, right? Because you say that there's government involvement in education. I'm not casting my hat in on whether that's a good thing or not, but what kind of education? If the government is deeply involved in providing education that basically creates, your MBAs that then take the sort of grassroots, element out of common life, then it seems to be working across purposes. In Vietnam, for instance, it's a sort of strange system that they have where it's a deeply communist government, but you don't have publicly funded education or publicly funded healthcare. They just don't have these 2 things. And their rationale is that we don't want a mass exodus from the farmlands into the city. We don't want people emigrating to America and Canada, and that's essentially the education systems that are in the offing are all designed to do that, because that's where these education systems were invented, let's say. So, and of course, if you don't have universal health care, then you don't want to move to the cities because, there's a lot of pollution and so forth. So they've managed to maintain a sort of agrarian economy as the basis of their society by precisely choosing not to get involved in education. So I don't think it's as starkly opposed as government involvement, more socialist, government removal, more capitalist, because these are more intricately involved processes. And I think what we should look at are, more broadly speaking, the 3 large concerns that we have, right? On the one hand, we need to be globally competitive, so we need professional schools to churn out engineers. On the other hand, we need people living in their land and actually having a community life, which is fast evaporating. If you go to the countrysides in many parts of India, they're just ghost towns almost. So we need to think deeply about whether or not education is that much of a universal good in those cases. Does education really improve people to the extent that they've forgotten how to farm and they've forgotten how to live in their land? And on the other hand, we need to think about the other mode of education that we've been talking about, which is namely to create citizens through through, rather than employees, I mean, through the, humanities and liberal arts and interdisciplinarity and things like that. And given that these three objectives are starkly opposed, I don't think we're going to benefit very much by pulling them under the basket of education. They're just different concerns, right?
I think that's a very important thing that you can contribute to, because there are several alternate education systems that are being built up, that are being seen nowadays. I think you are the best person to speak about the alternate kinds of education, because even the national education policy speaks about removing the decentralized autonomies of colleges and bringing it to a centralized tendency. But education is becoming more and more decentralized in foreign countries and all. How would you see that? How do you, what do you want to speak about this particular alternate education systems?
Okay, that's something that I'm very passionate about, which is what I predominantly do. Now, if you look historically, education has all about, it's always been about teaching and not much about learning, at least over the last couple of decades. It's changed from learning to teaching, more of teaching. Now, we need to move back to focusing on learning, because current learning is it's not child-centric, it's not child-led. Now, what happens in the traditional schools is you have a bunch of 50 students in a class, the teacher comes, lectures a topic, because the question paper is designed based on the textbook, so the teacher just need to check the boxes so that the child is taught on that, and he writes the exam, just spits out what he memorizes, and he gets a pass. And that's the reason why only 20% of India's graduates are employable, which is pathetic because of this system. Now, that's where alternate education comes into perspective. Now, if you look at the US, maybe you can add a lot, people are actually talking about unschooling. These are kids who actually stop going to schools because their parents and the children themselves feel that the traditional schooling, which is put in a box within a wall, is not going to help them. Then there is other bunch of students who are homeschoolers, where the parents sit with them, they are exposed, they know, they have the syllabus, they know kind of what to do with these students, and they kind of train them. Now, these students learn through projects, activities, game-based learning methodologies. Now, that makes education fun, the learning process fun, which means the children are more engaged in learning, and that means the retention is higher because they are more engaged and they know where to apply what they are learning and why they are learning certain things. The second element of alternate learning is there's something called primary learning modality, which is you might be a visual learner, you might be a kinesthetic learner, and I might be an auditory learner. But we have all been taught the same way in the school. The teacher comes and lectures, which means the auditory learner who likes to learn by listening excels, while the visual and the kinesthetic learner goes back. So what alternate learning is all about is creating 3 different types of learning choices, where a child comes to the school. I'll tell you what happens in my school. So in my school, a child comes to the campus. There's the same topic that is delivered at one point. 3 different children will learn the same topic in 3 different ways. So one child will learn by doing, one child will learn by listening, another child will learn by probably reading or by doing another project. So what happens is the child is taught the way he wants to learn. Now, this makes learning more effective. Now, coming to the other side of that's teaching, we always believe that the teacher is bound by the textbooks and the syllabus. So that needs to go away. The teachers need to be a lot more exposed to what's happening in the outside world, what we need to prepare the children for. They need to, even at school level, we want our teachers to be doing a lot more researches, going to industries, taking up live projects with companies, getting trained on different elements, so that they have a wider perspective of what they need to train the children on. So that to me is what alternate education or alternate learning model is. And that's evolving. So if you look at India, we have a lot of schools that are coming up today which are promoting alternate learning models. And parents to a large extent are happy to send their kids to alternate schools.
And one more thing, which I think both of you can respond to, is the deteriorating state of academic freedom in India, because we are continuously the points of India in academic freedom is being reduced. So in that sense, various forms of power is being exercised at the production of knowledge, because we can't research in certain topics, we can speak about certain topics. There is always a control, because you have already mentioned that history is being reconstituted, redesigned and restructured by the power systems. So various kinds of power are being exercised in education and knowledge production, etc. So how do you see the future of academic freedom in India?
It seems to me that there isn't necessarily a direct link between the freedom to produce whatever you want and excellent academic output. So I think you look at the great works during the most oppressive eras of the Soviet Union, for instance, or you look at England in the 19th century, repressed under Victorian culture, but nevertheless producing all these kinds of a kind of almost like a double language. There's an overt language of Oscar Wilde where somebody's saying something in a marriage, 3 is company and 2 is none. But implicitly sitting with his boyfriend and his wife next to him, it's understood as something else. So to a great degree, it's just factually the case that there is no necessary connection between lack of censorship and profound works. Right? So that's something to keep in mind. But nevertheless, Mill argues in Representative Government that one nevertheless needs to have a degree of autonomy in the production of knowledge, lest there emerge some great work that can, reorient society, push it in a particular direction that really is good for the society, as it were. Let's say your next Newton or Einstein emerges, and like the Third Reich, you decide, okay, I don't want Jews to produce works, and you miss out on the theory of relativity, which could have been a German theory. Now it's an American one. So it's a much more sort of duplicitous thing. I personally think that all history is propaganda, whether written under the illusion of freedom or under direct censorship. It is a mode of it's written by the victors. It's a mode of telling stories about what happened, and it's a way of arranging facts. Right? Arranging mere a registry of facts into a narrative. So already the fiction has begun, right? Even if your idea is to give a more accurate account, it's deeply fictional, the mode of storytelling. So it's not a direct answer about academic freedom, I'm afraid, because it's not a very. I mean, if you actually look at if you look at where research is actually contributing to weapon systems and petroleum engineering and so forth, there where economic concerns trump cultural concerns, it seems like there is no actual censorship, right? It's only along these in places where the government seems to think, the powers that be seems to think that there is a level of influence on culture that the censorship exists. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how it seems to me. So given that's the case, that just tells me that culture is being taken seriously. History is it wouldn't be censored if it wasn't being taken seriously, which is always a good sign.
So to me, academic freedom, it's a gray area, because most of the times we know that when it comes to subjects like history specifically or social sciences, there's always a lot of manipulation that happens. So then we say that, okay, then the government should probably step aside from the whole designing and having involvement in the curriculum and the syllabi. But then comes the question, then who will design this? So it's pretty much a gray area, at least in India. So probably we can look at other countries where a lot of the industry steps in terms of designing, which to a large extent. So last time I was attending an event where the university, the KTU's vice chancellor was speaking. So she said that there's only one person who's representing the industry when it comes to the entire curriculum designing, which is pretty sad. Rest everybody is or mostly political positions. Now what happens is there the industry representative is not going to play a very important role because it's politically driven and he's just a namesake representative, and because of which the academicians don't have a larger role there because they just need to implement what is being pushed to them. So what I feel is there needs to be a system that has a balance of both academicians as well as industry from the corporate, where the entire curriculum is designed in consultation with each other. And also, another element is that's where a lot of our bridging needs to happen between the academicians and the industry, because we want all our faculties. So somebody becomes a professor, he has done a research paper, he stops, at least in Kerala for that matter, a lot of the people stop learning. Now, that has to stop. The professors, the associate professors, the assistant professors, they all need to be continuously doing live projects with the corporates. They need to understand what's happening in the outside world, and then only it makes sense when both of them sit across the table to design the curriculum. They'll be able to make sense out of it. Otherwise, again, they'll be two different people sitting across a bridge, across a river with no bridge. So the element is there needs to be a lot of consultation that happens, and a body needs to be designed that will govern the whole thing. But it's quite difficult, without having the government, being influencing that system, at least in India.
And one more thing, what are the things that you need to suggest so that we can radically reform the education system in India? I think every one of us will have our own viewpoints so that we can change the current education system in India. What all will be the amendments that will you suggest to reshape the academic environment, the climate of education in India?
Well, I would go back to if you're designing something, you need to have a purpose in mind, right? Otherwise, you're just beginning with your feelings about what is good and so forth. If you're cutting a piece of wood, you need to know that I need it for a table and rather than a chair. So similarly, I think there are, broadly speaking, three different purposes that education pretends to serve. One being the creation of citizens, individuals, and the other being sort of people who are off the land and are somehow connected to the world in some profound way, and the other being sort of a general, as you were saying, we're the workforce of the world. I think that's broadly true. Being competitive in the global economy. So the first thing I would do for the first one, which is where I have some element of expertise, which is the idea of having a sort of humanities-based liberal arts education. The first thing I would do is I would add another buzzword to it: transdisciplinarity. The idea being that it's not necessarily different disciplines coming together, but transcending the idea of disciplines itself, right? So approaching specific questions without the sort of fetters of actual histories of disciplinary thought. So designing a course where people can really freely sort of flow from one place to another. That's one. The second thing is, there's broad sort of sounding and mouthing of generally pleasant things in the education policy about the Gurukul system and so forth. But I think the essential thing about it that Whitehead noticed about the Guru Shishya thing is a much more, let's say, deprofessionalized attitude towards writing, allowing people to inject their personality into the way they write, rather than producing this kind of deadpan prose that goes into making textbooks. Encouraging individuality, which might require greater facility with the language, and if that can only be done in a native language, then that's something one has to think about. And the third thing, of course, is what I was saying earlier, which is that children at a young age need to learn how food comes on their table. That's just, you mentioned America as an example. I mean, you've heard of the many surveys where children are asked where the apple comes from and they say the supermarket, right? So, that's something that it's there in the Constitution of India. Citizens are mandated to develop compassion for nature and so forth. I mean, although it'd be very hard to legislate compassion, I think it can be inculcated through things like having a program where children go to farms and basically see the production of rice through. From tilling the land to planting, how the water works, basically just more grounded to reality. So those would be the three broad changes: deprofessionalization, transdisciplinarity, and a more embodied form of learning.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. But coming to certain micro points, one is at a school level, yes, you rightly said learning has to become experiential, application oriented. But apart from that, I think it also has to become a lot more life skill focused in terms of knowing how to behave in a social space, in terms of believing and understanding that myself is a very important person and I need to focus on myself. There needs to be a lot of addition into our curriculum in terms of sex education, mental wellness. So these are issues that a lot of us don't talk about. So these are curriculum additions that need to happen. Another perspective is a lot of times everything is very preset. So for example, somebody who joins an engineering program, let's say he is not able to complete the program in 4 years. So he steps out in the year 1. There needs to be an option for him to be able to come back after a few years, pick up from where he left. Right? So he wants a transfer from this university to another university, or he says, I want to step aside for this semester and I'm going to study 5 MOOC programs, massive open online courses. So I need to be able to do 5 open online courses, and for which the university is giving that student credits. So he is not bound by the the preset context of what an engineering program is. So 3 years from now, the child probably is not able to finish engineering for, let's say, for family reasons. The student should probably get some kind of an incentive for having spent 3 years in college and for having cleared, let's say, 25 papers. So it could be a 3-year diploma program in engineering, or whatever fancy name you want to give it, so that program might help him get a job somewhere, and not, that will incentivize a lot of students to get back to universities, because we're going to talk about another 25 years, we're going to really see a lot of students drop out from universities and schools. So these kind of things will help our kids get back to universities and schools. So that's at a large scheme of things how I would want to see these small changes. Definitely the bigger points are what he spoke about.